As we kick off this year's event, I want to extend a big thank you to our generous community of advocates and supporters. We'd like to take a moment to say a special thank you to our presenting sponsors, Greater Twin Cities United Way and Frederickson and Byron. Thank you to our champion level sponsors, Aon, St. Stephen's Human Services, and Lutheran Social Services. And finally, we want to thank our leader and advocate sponsors. Thank you to Catholic Charities, People Serving People, the Salvation Army Northern Division, AIA Minnesota, Bridging, Common Bond Communities, Hearth Connection, MinCap, Simpson Housing Services, and the Wilder Foundation. We're so grateful and honored to have your support. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into the program. At last year's Homeless Day on the Hill event, we hosted our first ever virtual Homeless Day on the Hill event due to the pandemic. Together, we took a look back at the leadership and tenacity of advocates that dared to think big, collaborate, and advance big ideas. Like many of you, I was inspired by the courage and resolve of the advocates that shared about their journey. This year, we're looking forward with a lens of hope and abundance, leaning into the solutions that are based in community and culture. We've all navigated the past 2 years, which has felt very long, with perseverance. It has not been an easy time, but here we are with a historic budget surplus that has the power to change the trajectory of our work to make significant progress toward ending homelessness and housing instability in Minnesota. During today's program, we have 8 speakers that are here to share about the ways they are leading change and considering needs and opportunities to disrupt the status quo. As we hear more from these leaders, I hope it will inspire youth to think big, to think creatively, and to act boldly to advance housing, racial, and economic justice in our collective work. The first speaker I'd like to welcome is Tiki Brown, who's the Assistant Commissioner for Children and Family Services at the Minnesota Department of Human Services. Before joining as Assistant Commissioner, Tiki was the Director of the Economic Opportunity and Nutrition Assistance Divisions, where a significant portfolio of homeless assistance grants are located. Thank you for kicking off our lineup of speakers, Tiki.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Rhonda, and everyone else at the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless for inviting me here today to talk about the importance of reducing and preventing homelessness in Minnesota. On behalf of Commissioner Jody Harpstead, the Interagency Council on Homelessness, and your colleagues and allies in state government, I express our gratitude for everything you do to support, protect, and advocate for people facing homelessness and housing instability across Minnesota. As we all know, homelessness was already a big concern in Minnesota before the COVID-19 pandemic began, and it's only become worse throughout the pandemic. As a state, we need to devote more time and more resources to finding meaningful solutions that ultimately end homelessness for all Minnesotans, especially those in our Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, where homelessness rates continue to be disproportionately high. And we need to invite people who have experienced homelessness themselves to help us develop these solutions. From a financial standpoint, Governor Tim Walz and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan's 2022 budget proposes exactly the kind of game-changing investments that I'm talking about. In fact, 16% of their capital investment budget is dedicated to housing and homelessness, including the first ever budget proposal for capital, $72 million to build shelter capacity. That funding is critically important because after years of dramatic growth in the number of Minnesotans facing homelessness without shelter, we must work harder to strengthen shelter capacity statewide so that more Minnesotans have a safe place to stay. Homelessness, of course, is not equitable. We know that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are far more likely to experience homelessness than their white neighbors. And so the work that so many of you are doing right now is critically important to making our response to the pandemic and homelessness more equitable. As part of our response, DHS targeted COVID-19 funding for shelters to culturally specific providers by intensifying outreach about the availability of funds and offering technical assistance. We funded 100% of the culturally specific providers who applied and were eligible to receive funds. And we funded every tribal nation that applied for funding. Together, we did amazing work to mitigate and prevent the spread of COVID-19, including supporting more than 150 providers on the most urgent and critical needs during the pandemic: staffing, food, sanitation, and rehabilitation. These funds not only made it possible to maintain and even expand shelter capacity during the height of the pandemic, but also increase safety in existing shelters from an infectious disease perspective. A few examples of how this COVID-19 response funding was used include supporting the continued operation of the American Indian Community Development Corporation overnight drop-in program for unsheltered adults to rest, eat, and connect with helpers, supporting the rapid opening of additional shelters across the state to decompress crowded shelters and to provide an option for people staying outside, supporting new and innovative shelter models like the Avivo Village in Minneapolis, and creating new programs for delivering vaccine incentives, connecting people in shelters or outside with trusted messengers for vaccine education, and with tremendous support from our Lieutenant Governor and senior leadership with a staffing pool to help shelters in need. I hope this work inspires all of us to dream bigger about what we can accomplish on behalf of those experiencing homelessness in our state. We've already shown that we are capable of doing so much together, and I hope that continues. I'll close with this thought. Our Interagency Council on Homelessness, led by Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, who you'll hear from soon, has centered our work ahead on achieving housing, racial, and health justice for people experiencing homelessness. I know that securing the funding we've proposed and that you all are advocating for won't immediately bring about justice, but I hope that you'll see it as I do, as a down payment on getting there. So I wish you great success in helping lawmakers appreciate the urgency of these investments and the lasting impact they can make in the lives of Minnesotans. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiki. Thank you for your leadership and being part of an administration that recognizes the deep importance of investments to end homelessness and housing instability across the state. It's really crucial to advancing these priorities. Next, I'm excited to welcome Comfort Dondo, the founder of Pumulani, an organization on a mission to stop violence and abuse of women and children in the African immigrant community. Comfort is a seasoned transformational speaker who travels extensively around the world, advocating for safety and empowerment of domestic violence victims and survivors. Based in Brooklyn Center, Comfort strengthens the voices, champions the rights, and changes the lives of vulnerable women, restoring their hope and dignity. Thank you so much for joining us today, Comfort.
Thank you so much for having me. Good morning. My name is Comfort. As it said, today this week alone, I've received some really good news that I will be one of the Bush Fellow finalists. This is a really great accomplishment. Again, this month, I just received the fact that I will be publishing my second book. At least 5 years ago, I would not have been on this platform sharing such accolades and more that are happening. I managed to be able to accomplish this because I had the opportunity to secure some housing with dignity after at least about a decade being homeless after facing domestic abuse with 3 children. So I stopped by this morning to share my story and the stories of those women that reflect myself from the communities that I serve, that is African immigrant women. The pandemic has thrown the most vulnerable in our society into especially challenging circumstances, leading to a spike of domestic violence. In the US, we have seen about 8.7 to 9% rise in reported cases, while thousands go untold, specifically, for example, in communities like myself, communities like mine that are historically marginalized. According to the Council on Criminal Justice, Minnesota has seen over a 40% increase in intimate partner homicide since the pandemic. The relationship between domestic violence and housing insecurity is very much intersectional. Survivors struggle to leave dangerous situations when the other option is either to live on the street or in a shelter that might not allow them to bring all their children. These might be male children that are a certain age, mostly preteens, and or some extended family members that are still considered children under the law. There's a major gap in support in terms of residential facilities where women who are victims of violence can seek shelter while keeping their children. There's also a gap in suitable shelters for women like the women that come from my community who might be asylum seekers or refugees and other immigrant women who might lack access to public programs and resources. In our community, some of the needs that our research has shown is that culturally specific domestic violence programs have overwhelmingly positive results for women because they cater to all their needs, leading to a path of education and independence and self-sustainability. Even so, providers that offer culturally appropriate services are very limited in Minnesota for African immigrant survivors. The victim service providers tend to lump up African women or Black women as a monolith, but really women that are coming from the African immigrant community have peculiar needs. For instance, the average family household size might be 3 to 4 children, and this does not always fit in the mainstream shelter system. Our survivors want a safe place like all survivors, but even more than safety, they want dignity back. They also want their cultures to be honored as they are moving through the systems. We need an investment in culturally specific supportive transitional housing facilities in Minnesota. As the former speaker just mentioned, I think the DHS did a very tremendous job at the beginning of the pandemic, housing women, and these were mostly temporary. But then after the funds were gone, it was really hard to maintain the long-term transitional housing for the families that we serve. Beyond that, we also need an investment in our immigrant survivor population. We need to be able to reframe their vision for them, for going from victim to thrivers. And these resources include holistic approach to how we provide housing. That includes access to leadership development, access to mentorship, as well as making sure that their mental health and well-being is also considered. What would find helpful in our programming with Pumulani is that we are uniquely qualified to serve the communities because our staff represents and are from the communities served. That is the Black, Indigenous communities of color. Most of the survivors come back to serve either on our board or as staff. To date, our program has served over 4,236 survivors, 90% of whom are women of color, not only from our community, but from throughout Minnesota, including rural Minnesota. 89% of our clients are immigrants, 80% are low-income individuals and families. Our women are learning to speak in our healing circles that we host every 6 weeks period. And through telling their stories and empowering each other, they're sharing how to go from surviving to thriving. Our vision from the future is that we have a network of truly culturally specific transitional housing facilities that function as also educational facilities, community centers, and business incubators for our survivors. We want to be a model that's transformative, that is not lacking, but actually offers hope and abundance. And for us, supporting our survivors is supporting them to a journey of self-sustainability so they can become thrivers and not just survivors, so they can flee from abuse for the rest of their life and the generations to come. And this will start with understanding the holistic approach of providing culturally specific housing. I thank you so much for the investment in our community so far, and we look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you so much, Comfort, for sharing your story and sharing the transformational power of relationships and culture to transform services that are essential to so many of our BIPOC communities and all throughout the state. And thank you for sharing that information about the Bush Fellowship too. I certainly hope that your name shows up on that final list. Next, we have Pastor Erica and Pastor Colette Brody Grund from Connection Shelter in Mankato. In their work, they are building a community that is grounded in social justice and deep care for one another. Welcome, Pastors Colette and Erica.
Hi, I'm Pastor Colette Brody Grund.
And I'm Pastor Erica Kozer, and we are honored to be with this group presenting this morning. We want to tell you a little bit about Connection Shelter. We are a 35-bed, low-barrier, seasonal emergency homeless shelter that welcomes all genders and family compositions and sees each guest as a beloved child of God, worthy of radical welcome and care. We are located in Mankato, Minnesota, and serve the southeastern region of our state. 5 years ago, we began as a rotating homeless shelter, moving each week from church basement to church basement. But as we began to understand the needs of our guests, we realized that a single site would serve our guests better and allow us to work towards the goals of holistic care. We partnered with a local congregation and set up our single site, increasing our bed space from 25 to 35 and expanding our community partnerships to more fully serve our guests. Throughout the pandemic, we have seen the need for emergency beds in our community grow, as evidenced by our lengthy waiting list that we have had all season. It's time to grow our shelter and our vision again. Our new vision is to build a 50-bed year-round facility within the next 2 to 3 years that will ease the need for emergency shelter beds in our region and allow us to continue to provide holistic, sustainable solutions for those facing homelessness, truly creating a community center of care.
As a faith-based organization, we believe deeply in the abundance of a good God. That abundance has been evident throughout our ministry, especially in our pool of volunteers. We have over 450 church and community members who connect with the faces and stories of those experiencing homelessness every season. And because of their work at the shelter, these volunteers have become advocates for and partners with our shelter guests, leading to an abundance of awareness about homelessness in our area. Abundance is also a great way to describe the outpouring of care that we invest in our shelter guests, walking with them intentionally and compassionately, sharing their joys and their burdens. This community of care empowers our guests to find sustainable solutions to their needs.
Our hope is found in our partnerships with community agencies coming together around our shelter guests to provide holistic care, leading to healing that is physical, emotional, and spiritual. This looks like a 25-year-old mom who recently showed up at the shelter with her 2-year-old son. She had lived in 17 other cities in the last 3 years before arriving on our doorstep. While in the shelter, she was able to receive medical care for herself and her son through our partnership with Open Door Clinic. When she found her new apartment, she was able to have it furnished through donations from our community and our supporters. And she was able to find a job that feeds her soul and her son. In this family and in so many others that we serve, hope returns through restored dignity and community.
Statewide support for our planned capital project and our operating expenses would allow our staff to fully focus on caring for guests and finding solutions rather than always fundraising. Those with lived experience are our best teachers. And we know that relationships are what lead to success, both for our guests and our organization. But building those relationships of depth and trust takes time. And that's something that nonprofit leaders are always short on. Significant support from the state, both through that proposed shelter capital funding of $100 million and the emergency services program, would allow us to invest in building those relationships, which move people not only to housing stability, but into communities that support them long after they have left our shelter. In the words of one of our guests who just moved to housing, I know at a time I will need an ear to listen and a mouth to respond with words of wisdom, even if it's words I might not want to hear. The picture we took when I left shelter will be hanging up in my apartment as a reminder. Thanks for having us.
Thank you both for sharing your organization's journey and your commitment to bringing dignity in your work with your community. Your shelter project is such a great example of the changing nature of shelter in our state and how rural communities, metro communities, and suburban communities have models that work specifically for theirs. And so thank you for sharing about that. I'm excited to share that our next speaker is Leanne Littlewolf, the co-executive director of the American Indian Community Housing Organization located in Duluth. The American Indian Community Housing Organization transforms oppression into opportunity. Created in 1993, ACO started in a parking lot outside a social service agency with a conversation between Native community members who asked why their community had no resources, no community spaces, and no services that met their cultural needs. ACO was created as an Indigenous response to social conditions in Duluth, Minnesota, powered by the urban Native American community. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Leanne.
Yeah, thank you, Rhonda. It's great to be here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Leanne Littlewolf. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-executive director for the American Indian Community Housing Organization, also known as ACO. I'm going to do a traditional introduction as well. Indisogijik indigo, maingan indu dame, idash gazagaswa jimikag na unjaba. My spirit name is Every Day. I belong with the Wolf Clan, and I come from Leech Lake Nation. Akaway, which means first. I want to recognize the land that we currently live and work on originally was and continues to be the homelands of Indigenous people. Where I am today in Duluth, we currently enjoy access to this land because the land was ceded in a nation-to-nation treaty process between the Anishinaabe and the United States government in the Treaty of 1854. And I believe by recognizing Indigenous homelands, we accept that we have a shared history, and we make a commitment to shape our ongoing relationships based in justice and reconciliation, and that those are our guiding values. I really believe in that. That's really important to me. One of the issues that I would like to speak about is that in our homelands today, Indigenous people are really overrepresented in homeless and unsheltered counts and life experiences. ACO, we were created in 1993, so over 30 years ago. One of the first things that our organization did was create the Dabanugan shelter, which is a 10-bed domestic violence emergency shelter. It is the only culturally specific shelter in our region, and it provides not only safety, immediate shelter, and resources, but it also meets our cultural needs. With 10 beds, we worked with a range of 100 to 30 to 190 individuals per year. But we had over 500 requests each year that we weren't able to meet because we were full. And we're working right now on expanding that shelter. And we're excited about that. That project's in process. And then in addition to shelter, we recognize that people need a stable, affordable housing. And we're working on a 50-unit new project. It's affordable housing development project. And just to reference, right now, we currently operate a 29 permanent supportive housing program called Gamaji Mino Gama Dizimin, which means we are all of us together starting a good life. And when we opened the doors in 2012, we had over 400 applications for 29 units. So the need is real. It has been for some time. And right now, I think more than ever, we have many relatives right now who are living outside in tents and stairwells and shelters, or just trying each day to figure out where they're going to be. And then at the same time, we have done good work, and we have really creative and cultural solutions and practices. I would say during the pandemic, we pivoted and we started to do emergency food distribution, and we were able to include our cultural foods, our traditional foods. That's really important to our people. Because we have a number of people who are unsheltered, we were shared knowledge from other Native organizations who do this, but they make food that is specific to people who are living outside or unsheltered. Really important. And people who have chronic health issues or disease, they need specific foods. At the same time, we were able to give out COVID information and do that in a cultural way. And we worked with our Indigenous artists, to do that messaging and to send those important messages in a way that really resonates with our people. Right now, we're launching social enterprises that are based on our cultural strengths. So I just want to say that we have a lot of good work that's happening, and we need to build from that. And we need good partnerships invested in figuring out how to increase shelter and affordable housing. And at this time of abundance, we really need to be wise with our resources and make these critical investments with the most basic needs of safety and shelter. So I just want to say, I want to say that's it. You and miigwech. I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you so much, Leanne, for sharing and for being here today, and just sharing about the incredible ways that ACO continues to use culture and cultural practices in the work that you do. Next up, I would like to welcome Asali Soul and Charles from Urban Homeworks. Asali Soul is leading the work of Urban Homeworks with an equity and justice lens. Their passion for a more humane, whole society comes with unrelenting compassion for those without stable homes. Asali Soul believes there is more than enough for everyone to have what they need and asks us to remember the histories that brought us to this moment of perceived crisis and scarcity. Welcome Asali Soul and Charles.
Good morning, and thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Asali Soul Young. I use she or they pronouns, and I'm the executive director of Urban Homeworks. We are a small affordable housing organization with 139 units of affordable, dignified housing across the Twin Cities, with a vision of neighbors raising their collective voices to eradicate systemic barriers. The focus of our housing is to provide stability so that the people who live there can move beyond surviving to thriving. Today, I'm joined by one of those people, Charles Kane. Charles has lived in Urban Homeworks housing since 2013 and has since founded a much needed community-centered nonprofit. Brothers Empowered is an organization that Urban Homeworks has come to partner with for community-centered safety initiatives, peacekeeping, and building. Charles, welcome, and thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure. Before I came to Urban Homework, I was homeless. I had just lost housing. And being a single father with two boys, it was a traumatic time in my life. I remember sleeping from couch to couch, different women's house. I've slept in every hotel in the metro area. And also, just feeling loss of direction. I've had to do some things while I was homeless, that compromised my value as a father, my value as a man, that kind of put my safety and, put me in risk of being incarcerated. But when I found Urban Homework, it gave me that foundation back. It put me in a position to become the parent, the father that I was striving to be, the excellent father. And in that pursuit, I was able to start Brothers Empowered, founded it in 2014, about a year after being in Urban Homework. So my story is the foundation of having a stable housing, stable, affordable, sustainable housing that's comfortable, safe, to build community, family. It brought the jewel inside of me out. It brought my destiny out. Being able to serve the community in the capacity that I'm doing right now with my organization, Brothers Empowered. So Urban Homework played a major part of that role.
Thanks so much, Charles, for sharing your story. Every time I revisit your journey, I'm inspired. And I know that there are many others with similar struggles whose lives would be changed by the stability of dignified, affordable housing. And as a state right now, we have a unique opportunity before us with an unprecedented amount of undesignated resources, $9.25 billion of government surplus for this fiscal year. In a state where nearly 500,000 families are spending more than 30% of their income on housing alone, I'm here today to make a big ask, to ask the governor, the House, and the Senate to set aside $2.7 billion, just $2.7 billion of that 9.25, to make a bold statement with deep investments across the housing continuum, from shelters and support services to affordable, dignified rentals and home ownership opportunities that will support fathers like Charles, homeless single parents working to give themselves, their families, and their communities so much more than they had. This level of investment will provide families in Minnesota across the housing spectrum. Roughly 500,000 families will have access to safe, dignified shelter and housing they can afford. That leaves room in their budgets for basic necessities like food, clothing, transportation, and medical care. This funding will provide 2,000 shelter beds to the 80 counties currently under-resourced. It will provide homes for over 8,000 unhoused Minnesota families. It will help to keep over 10,000 precariously housed families in their homes. And the result will create more than 22,000 jobs. We have the unique opportunity to transform housing stability right now. So I ask you to imagine the prosperity this will provide communities across the state. Let's say yes to giving a fraction of the surplus towards shelter and services, towards stable, affordable housing. Let us say yes to supporting Minnesota families whose housing costs constitute 30 to 50% of their budget, leaving them with little than any other resources. We have the capacity, we have the abundance. All we need is the will. Every one of us should have stable places to call home. Every Minnesotan should be treated with dignity and permitted to rebuild their lives and be allowed to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you, Asale Soul, and thank you, Charles, for sharing your story. You know, everything you said today is so absolutely true, and just pointing out the deep impact that a safe and dignified home has to transform lives and communities. Home is truly the foundation, and thank you both for the important work that you're doing. Next up, I'd like to welcome Thomas Adams, who is the Vice President of Housing and Services at Common Bond Communities. Based in the Twin Cities, Common Bond is one of the largest developers of affordable homes in the upper Midwest. Before joining Common Bond, Tommen was the CEO of Better Futures, an organization that seeks to change systems that lock men, primarily African-American men, into experiencing homelessness, incarceration, and behavioral health issues into long-term dependency. Thomas recently joined the MCH Board of Directors, and I want to welcome Thomas to the space. Thank you for being here with us today, Thomas.
Thank you. Again, good morning. My name is Dr. Thomas Adams, the Executive Vice President of Housing and Services at Common Bond Communities. We're a nonprofit affordable housing developer and property management organization serving over 9,000 low-income residents in urban, suburban, and rural parts of Northwest, Central, Southeast, and the Twin City region of Minnesota. Our mission is to provide stable homes, strong futures, and vibrant communities. We believe that stable, safe, and affordable homes provide a family with all the tools necessary to build vibrant and thriving communities. Common Bond believes that the solution to homelessness and housing instability resides within the communities we serve. At Common Bond, over 70% of our residents are persons of color. Through our resident councils, our frequent meetings at our housing communities, by building resident leadership capacity through formal trainings, we seek to partner and learn from those that we serve. We center them in decision-making that guide our organization and guide our advocacy. As stated before, Minnesota is at a unique opportunity in our time. We have over $9 billion, and I'm asking again that we use at least 2.7 of that billion to significantly invest in housing and homelessness prevention services. Investments such as shelters, funds for affordable housing development, increased funding for rental assistance, as we are all still being impacted, negatively impacted by COVID-19, and other points along the housing continuum are all critically needed. I'm excited that we have such an opportunity exist in our state today, and that we can make a monumental decision to significantly reduce the number of homeless and housing insecure citizens who call Minnesota home. So thank you for allowing me to speak today. And again, I asked that you consider this request of $2.7 billion of investment in housing and homeless prevention funding.
Thank you, Thomas, for speaking with us today and for lifting up the solutions that we have. And I want to extend a big thank you to all of our speakers. You've highlighted so many of the solutions and opportunities we have in our state in this pivotal moment in time. Next up, I'm going to pass it over to Zach. Zach, take it away.
Thanks, Rhonda, and thank you to everybody for being here for our Homeless Day on the Hill. It's so wonderful to see so many participants, even in a virtual world, and just knowing that there's so many of our great advocates out there really helps all of us do this work just so much better. I am just so excited to be here to present the 2022 policy agenda from MCH. So really what we're doing as we look at the policy agenda is that what is the experience that a family or individual who experiences homelessness, what is that journey, and what are the barriers that we need to identify and make changes to? So to do that, what we did was we went out into the community, we talked with folks with lived experience, we talked to our partners, our providers, and asked, what are these barriers that folks are experiencing? And how can we as advocates and an advocacy organization work to make those barriers less burdensome for folks? And so the first thing that we learned from people in the community was that there isn't enough spaces for people for shelter. You know, across the state, 80 of our 87 counties, according to our latest data, have either no shelter beds or not enough shelter beds to meet the need in their community. So what we need to do is invest in creating some shelter. We went out, we did a survey, we asked folks, if you had money right now, what would be that dream project that you want to do? What is the services that you want to be able to provide in your community? And we ended up with 51 projects across the state, across every continuum of care. And we found that there was $100 million worth of need to invest to expand and preserve our emergency shelter beds. What we're hoping to do is, provide that safe, accessible shelter that's culturally appropriate and close to your community so that folks don't have to be traveling all over the state to be able to get the services we know that they need. So speaking of services, the next part of this agenda is, of course, funding for those services within those shelters. And we're doing that through the Emergency Services Program. What we're advocating for is $95 million over the next 3 years, not $35 million this year, and then $60 million over the next biennium and beyond. And what we're trying to do is create more resources so that shelters, who are local providers that know the local solutions to homelessness are able to provide those resources to folks in their community. We want to be able to use ESP for our shelter operations, of course, our hotel and motel vouchers, and also the other great things that ESP can do, such as transportation, childcare, mental health care, outreach services, all of these great things that we know ESP can do. We want to be able to provide those services across the state in a way that really addresses the needs of folks experiencing homelessness, in their local communities. So for a lot of people who go into homelessness, on their way back into permanent housing, sometimes people make a pit stop in something we call time-limited housing. And the time-limited housing option that we are looking at as MCH this year is the Transitional Housing Program. And we're advocating for a $9 million investment and a timeline extension in this program. So moving from 24 to 36 months that people can be in that program. We heard from people with lived experience and providers that having a little bit more time to get stable, get some rental history, put down roots in a community really helps to make that transition into permanent housing that much more successful. Additionally, we know that there is a shortfall in that budget between requests and what's available. So we want to advocate for that increase of $9 million so that we can expand the transitional housing program to meet the need in the state. Of course, transitional housing program being time limited, we know that another thing that's desperately needed here in Minnesota is permanent housing. So what we're advocating for is $500 million in bonds for housing this year, including $400 million in housing infrastructure bonds to develop, as well as $100 million in general obligation bonds to rehab our existing public housing. We need to make sure that we are keeping our existing housing stock and creating more so that we actually have enough houses and homes for everyone here in Minnesota. So to that end, and you've heard a little bit about this from some of our other speakers, we're partnering with a whole host of other housing organizations in a broad ask for huge targets this year. And we're going to be asking for $2 billion at least in housing targets this year so that we have enough resources with this historic surplus to actually meet the need. So we're going to be advocating with Homes for All and a whole host of other housing advocacy organizations to be able to do this across that full continuum of housing. There's so many other policies that we wish we could highlight here today, but really we know that shelter saves lives and housing ends homelessness. So with that, I'm going to toss it back over to Rhonda.
And she's here. This is exciting. Thank you. I couldn't see on my screen that you were here. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to do a quick intro. Peggy Flanagan is a mom, an advocate, a member of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe, and Minnesota's 50th Lieutenant Governor. Her career is built on standing up for children, working families, communities of color, and Indigenous communities, and Minnesotans who have historically been underserved and underrepresented. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor, for joining us today, and excited to hear more about how you're advancing policies that will prevent homelessness, address homelessness, and increase housing stability for Minnesotans across the state.
Well, thank you so much, Rhonda. I'm super excited to be here with all of you today. This is one of my favorite days on the Hill. We are in a virtual Hill, but still just so incredibly grateful for the work that everyone who is part of this conversation does every day. I know that each and every one of you is bringing your whole heart and your whole selves to this work, and I just want you to know that I see you. So thank you for being here. And I know that you heard from Tiki Brown earlier, and I know she shared some of the key points of our proposal, but I also, I just want to take a moment to recognize the weight of the last 2 years and just the sort of superhuman response that all of you have brought to this work and to this advocacy. It's been an incredibly challenging time, especially for our friends and neighbors without access to stable housing or supportive housing programs. And I also know how hard it has been for each of you working in this space to keep moving forward. To ensure that folks have access to masks and safe spaces and support services to weather the COVID-19 storm. And there have been extra barriers and obstacles that exist already, but it is just been incredibly important work, and I have been deeply encouraged to watch all of you do it. So I see you, and I'm just so grateful for it. And I know that we all have experienced collective trauma throughout this pandemic, and the individual trauma that folks experience in their own lives is real. So just as we are continuing to do this work, and we have a lot of work ahead of us, just remembering to be gentle with yourself and with others as we are advocating fiercely for the things that we need. So our proposals are rooted in the deep recognition of the importance of all of your work and of housing stability for all, and of righting the injustice of homelessness in our state. These investments in our housing and homelessness package are historic and transformational because this work needs and deserves this investment. So we continue building upon, and I think you probably heard me say this before, but it's really, about scaffolding, and each legislative session pushing for more and building for more. So in last year's budget, the governor and I were proud to partner with the legislature and with advocates to sign into law key funding to address this work, including a historic $100 million in housing infrastructure bonds to preserve and expand access to affordable housing, an historic increase to the emergency service provider base funding, $6.3 million to support ending veterans homelessness, and $20 million to support local aid for homelessness prevention. This work also built on the funding and supports that the governor focused on during our COVID-19 response to ensure that our friends and neighbors and relatives experiencing homelessness were not left out of the crisis response. And so our response to homelessness across the state includes prevention, crisis response, and funding for additional services, and the creation of much needed affordable housing. We've proposed significant investments in shelter operations in our budget, including $95 million over 3 years for the emergency services program, $72 million in capital for shelters, a near doubling of our Homeless Youth Act, providing services, shelter, and housing for homeless youth, including our LGBTQ+ youth and young parents, new programs for survivors of domestic violence, and a strengthening of our investments and commitments to people experiencing homelessness, living with and recovering from addiction. So these budget recommendations address the reality of housing stability needs, because we know that this work requires smart investments across the full spectrum of housing needs, including preserving affordable housing, creating new housing for low-income Minnesotans, and doubling our investments in rental assistance and homelessness prevention. Altogether, the governor and I are recommending investing $1 billion in housing and homelessness supports over the next 3 years in this supplemental budget. And now this budget, process shifts over to the legislature, which is why this day is so incredibly important, to make sure that our voices are heard, and it will be up to all of us to determine what kind of state Minnesota chooses to be. And our budget proposal is ambitious because it is creating a Minnesota where everyone has access to a safe place to call home, and that requires boldness. And that is the moment that we find ourselves in. This work is not done in a vacuum. You are advocates, you are folks with lived experience. Your voices, your stories, your narratives matter, and that is how we get this across the finish line. So when Minnesotans take the time to talk with their legislators about what this means, we get to the real human beings behind all these, data points and budget proposals, and that, I think, is what can change hearts and minds. So please share your stories with elected leaders. Ask them for what we need to solve this crisis. And I know that the governor and I will continue to push from this side. So thank you for everything that you do. And I just want to again say that the humanity, the dignity of ensuring that our relatives experiencing homelessness have what they need to live full, beautiful lives, and for us to have housing stability for all Minnesotans in this state is not a dream that we cannot achieve. It is absolutely within our grasp, and with this surplus, with our determination, we can get there. So Gitchi Miigwech, thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for being here and advocating for all Minnesotans to be able to have a safe place to call home. I'm honored to be in this fight with all of you, and I'm just ready to get to work. So thank you, Rhonda, for all you do, and for all the advocates who are here and all the people with lived experience. You're my people and I'm your people, and I am grateful for the work. So let's get it done. Thank you.
Finally, I guess I just want to close out our program today with a big thank you to our speakers and to all of you, our advocates and allies that continue to show up day after day, and for some of you, year after year. I hope that you're energized and ready to meet with your legislators to advance the policies that we've talked about today. We hope to see you tweeting, posting on Facebook and Feedloop, at the press conference, and in those legislative visits. Thank you again for joining us this morning, and we will see you very soon.